bass.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm. Brought to you by FunkandStuff.net, this is the interview show that gets deep in the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. I am your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine, musicologist, creative arts journalist, and multimedia pro. Whether you're watching the video version of this show or the audio-only podcast version, I thank you so much for your continued interest and support in this show. If you enjoy this programming, there are several ways to help support Truth and Rhythm, as well as contribute to further enhancements and expansion, plus get some sweet perks and rewards in the process. First, subscribe to the Funk and Stuff channel on YouTube, which is where Truth and Rhythm lives, and be an advocate by spreading the word among fellow funk, jazz, and R&B music lovers. Second, join Truth and Rhythm's new membership program through Patreon, which features 3 tiers for truth believers, truth seekers, and truth crusaders. You can also submit a direct donation to the cause anytime at funkandstuff.net. At that site, which is loaded with awesome content, you can also purchase the book Everything's on the One, The First Guide of Funk. Shop for official Truth and Rhythm and Funk and Stuff merchandise, and use the Amazon links for all of your online purchases, which allocates a percentage to this show. Sponsorship opportunities are available as well. Contact me directly at scottg@funkandstuff.net. For those of you who go the extra step in supporting the show, you have my heartfelt gratitude for allowing us to continue to shine the light on those special artists whose quest is to find truth in rhythm.
I'm delighted to welcome to the Truth and Rhythm Mothership producer, composer, drummer, and remixer Jimmy Bralower, who has been associated with records surpassing 350 million units in sales. Cutting his teeth with Kurtis Blow in 1980, he went on to work with dozens of stars, including Carly Simon, Madonna, Hall & Oates, Nile, Rodgers, Sheena, Easton, Billy Joel, Power Station, Duran, Steve Winwood, Chaka, Billy Squier, Peter Gabriel, Cyndi, Lauper, Brian Wilson, Eric Clapton, Phoebe Snow, George Benson, the Bee Gees, and Britney Spears. He now runs a production business that includes Dynotone Records and offers a full range of artist recording services. Jimmy, I hope I got all that right, and welcome to the show.
You did. Thanks. Good to be here, man.
Where are you today?
I'm in my little basement studio in Long Island, New York. And this is where I spend a whole lot of my time. Recording, mixing, mastering, you name it. This is it. And, you know, it really became home during the pandemic when there was no place to go. It turned out to be a perfect thing to have around here.
Well, before we get too far into it, I want to just mention and thank Jeff Bova for kind of connecting us. So
right. My old partner
Jeff.
in crime. Yep.
Yeah. So appreciate that. And thank you, Jimmy, again for doing this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, man.
So, what was it like for you growing up, and what drew you to music in the first place, Jimmy?
I loved music as a little kid. My parents had these photos of me when I was like 4 years old. I had a little record player with those yellow, kitty golden discs, and so I was always with the music. And it was about 10 or so. I kind of connected with what was on the radio. Early 60s, very early 60s. I would love music. I couldn't play. I tried to take piano lessons, saxophone lessons, because I liked those guys on American Bandstand. But it turned out, my fine motor skills for playing like guitar and piano were like not so great. And so I was a fan until, like everyone else, had their Beatle epiphany. I happened to have, at the time, me and a few of my friends had a singing group. This was before the Beatles. None of us could sing, But what we did was we got this device from the back of a comic book. It was like a megaphone. It's sort of like a Flintstones kind of device, where it came with these blank discs you put on your record player, and you sang into this megaphone. It had like this needle, and it cut discs. And what we were going to do was make recordings, send them to record companies, and make a scrapbook of rejection slips from record companies. And then the Beatles came along, and we all decided, wait a minute, this looks like something we could do. And I got designated with my friends as the drummer. And I had a couple of pencils and a hat box. And I found that the thing that was preventing me from playing all these other instruments when I was a kid wasn't preventing me from playing the drums. And, you know, that just opened everything up. You know, I was like in 7th grade, not knowing what life was going to be for me. I couldn't figure anything out at the time, nor should I have. But I got so sucked into it. Playing in a band was like the ultimate thing to do. And that kind of drove me for many years. And the music of that era was like, it's hard to explain to somebody who didn't live through the actual timeline of this stuff coming out in real time, one thing after another. It was like an assault. It was unbelievable. And if you were prone to being taken by it, it totally, you know, was overwhelming. And so for a period of about 4 or 5 years, it was like constant reinforcement for me. It was all through high school and into college that this clearly, you know, gave me the kind of, you know, sense of purpose that I didn't really have any other way. So it was real early on. And it's still there. I'm still driven by the energy from then, to be honest with you.
And how did your drum skills progress?
Well, I had a band. I learned how to play in a band, first of all. So this was like in '64. Beatles came in like early '64. My band did our first gig in like October of '64, like at our school. And we learned how to play. We were, like I said, we weren't great singers. So in those days, there were the Ventures. There were a lot of instrumental bands. There's a lot of surf music. So we were like an instrumental band. And we really learned how to play, being in the band, listening to the radio. And we got a record contract with Columbia like 2 years later. In 1966, we got signed to Columbia. And we got good really fast. You know, between all the music that was coming out and all the instrumentals, the Ventures were pretty proficient musicians. To learn those songs was to get any good. And then I had a drum teacher who was a bebop drummer. He was like a jazz drummer from the '40s, and he taught me to play music, not drums. That was like the biggest thing I got from that guy, which really made the biggest difference for me. I was into playing songs, not the instrument was a means to an end to participate, you know, which is how I was able to jettison further down my career into expanding into other areas, because it became clear to me that that making records was what I really liked to do. And that was my ticket to get in, you know, right in the middle of it. So, we got good fast by playing in the band. I'm grateful for that, you know.
Your trial by fire kind of thing.
Yeah, but you know, it's one thing to play your instrument by yourself and play along with records. It's another thing to actually, you know, have that interaction and learn how to collaborate. All the things that you don't do anymore, basically. You know, it was a great skill set to have, and really stood me well once I got into doing studio work and stuff, you know, knowing how to work with other people.
Did you have some original tunes with that first band?
Yeah,
or?
one of the guys in my band, he was a Juilliard piano player when he was like 10 years old. He was like a great musician, and he transferred to guitar when, you know, the band started happening, and he knew how to write. And so he had written some songs, And it just so happened that a relative of mine knew somebody who was a music publisher, and we made these little demos, and she played it for this guy, and he found out we were like 14 years old. He says, "Oh, I just helped this guy get a job at Columbia." And it was just like one of these things, and we went and auditioned up at Columbia Records, which was completely unnerving. I mean, we'd been playing literally for 2 years, almost, you know, like less than 2 years. It was our audition with Columbia was 2 years and a day after the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. So from not playing anything to being there, it was 2 years. Pretty amazing, actually. You know, pretty prolific 2 years of my life, actually.
So were you in high school at the time? Or?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Started in junior high. I was in like 9th grade by the time this started happening. And,
Wow.
you know, it came and it went. I mean, we cut 4 songs. We did a session and released a single. And, you know, that was it. Nothing really came of it. And, but at the time I thought, oh, you play in a band, you get a record contract, you know, which then I spent like the next 10 years of my life trying to get back to where I was when I was 14.
Right. Like overnight
you know,
sensation by the long path. Yeah. Were your
Yeah.
parents supportive?
Yes. Yeah. My dad was a real music fan, and his parents, weirdly enough, didn't want him to play the piano because they saw he liked it so much. They made his brother play, who didn't like it at all. So my dad had this affinity for it. The minute he saw I was serious, we were the house where the band rehearsals were a lot of the times, you know, throughout the years I was there. We were always in my basement or my parents' den. Always, we were the band practice house. So they really put up with it, drove us to gigs, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I was fortunate to have that support system for sure.
Who were some of your influences musically, specifically on drums and then overall? I'm sure Ringo was a big drumming influence, but were there others?
Well, you know, I liked all the stylists. You know, I didn't recognize at the time what it was. I was not a technical drummer. I never was. My technique was not the best. My time was really good. My feel was really good. And the musicians, you know, Ringo obviously was an influence, but, you know, in those days, in that moment, it was Ringo and Charlie. And I was a Dave Clark fan. I don't know that he was necessarily really playing on those records, but Bobby Graham, who apparently did, you know, he played on Kinks records and stuff. It was just, you know, all those timekeepers. I was really fascinated by that. And then my drum teacher was a big, he was very musical. And, you know, so he was not like the Buddy Rich side of drumming. It was more like the Krupa side, which was very melodic. Max Roach, Art Blakey, very musical drummer. So I got turned on to that stuff by him. And, there, you know, it was playing the instrument. It was a support, you know, in real life. It wasn't just playing rudiments. It was backing up a singer, you know, as time went on for me anyway. It was, he always said to me, listen to the singer, you know, play to the singer, listen to the melody, you know, and support what's going on. And, you know, I took that to heart. And so, you know, Ginger Baker, I mean, in those days, Mitch Mitchell, all of those guys, they all brought something slightly different to the table. Keith Moon, a lot of stylists, a lot of personality, you know, it was not generic at all. So there were different things about each of those guys that, you know, I would find appealing. They didn't all necessarily apply to what I was doing, but style was something I was very conscious of. You know, and still to this day, I really believe that, you know, style is one of the more important things in pop music as a musician, you know, that, you know, you can identify yourself by your playing, that people kind of know who you are, that you're not just, we call them seat fillers, get me a guitar player or get me Eric Clapton, you know, get me a drummer, get me Jim Keltner, get me Steve Ferroni. You know, these are people who do certain things that you called them to do, you know. And I didn't realize it when I was a kid, you know, just how important identifying yourself somehow or other, giving some sort of separation between you and the other guy. Style, you have to evolve. You know, that's a very personal thing. And some people never get that far. You know, they got the chops, but, you know, in the kind of environments I worked in and still do, style counts for a lot. Singers, where, you know, you could tell the voice a mile away. You know, the technically great singer is not necessarily the one who is the successful artist. It's the one with the sound. You know?
Yeah, that's what really touches people in the long run, I believe.
Yeah.
So, Jimmy, what transpired then, in a nutshell, from then until, like, you know, the Kurtis Blow stuff?
Well, the 70s was like kind of a weird time for me because, you know, I was in the cocoon with my band in high school, and like so many people who do things in high school, athletes and stuff, once they go off to college, you know, you're just in a pool of like similar people from everywhere else. I didn't study music in college. I studied business. And, you know, there was something missing. I kept quitting school basically to be in bands. After my, I guess in the middle of my junior year of college, I was in a band over the summer after my sophomore year that got into a recording situation. And I needed to go up to Boston to record this album. It was October. It was like the second month of school. And, you know, there was no question in my mind I was going to take the couple of weeks and disappear to do that. And I kept gravitating to that. In those days, there were no music colleges where you could get degrees in the music business. Or as a drummer, I really didn't feel like, you know, going to a music college that was classically based, where, you know, I'd be hitting a cymbal every 50 measures or something. It really wasn't what interested me. You know, I was very pragmatic in terms of what I wanted to do with this. I didn't want to just be a musician. I wanted to do music I liked. That was always the through line for me. And that was an era where I didn't really get to do music I liked. I was kind of floating around trying to find bands to be in. And so the 70s was a real transitory time for me, where you know, I would do all these different things, but it was also not the same as the 60s were musically. You know, things changed so quickly back in those days. You know, today, you know, hip hop, since I did those Kurtis Blow records, I mean, hip hop is still driving the culture. It's like 40 something years. In those days, you had, you know, Motown stacks, you had psychedelic stuff. This all happened in like 3 or 4 years. Shit came and went, you know. In the 70s, there was, you know, it was changing a lot, and drumming was changing in terms of, you know, the venues that people were playing in were bigger and bigger. The amplifiers got bigger, the drum kits got bigger. And, you know, I started out on a little bebop kit, you know, just the kind of drums that were around in those days. And, you know, drumming kind of got more Olympic sport-like over time. You know, it was like sweatbands, and, you know, it was, the cymbals went higher and higher. The hardware got bigger and fatter. The drums got bigger and louder. And, you know, it started becoming more of, you know, hit them as hard as you can kind of an instrument, rather than a finesse thing, which is what I learned how to do. And so I was having this kind of battle. You know, the click track showed up during disco. I was used to keeping time. You know, Ringo has this line, "I am the fucking click track," you know, and you know, as a drummer in a band, you know, you're the heartbeat, you know, and I trusted my sense of time. Once it was with the click track, I was working with people who were not as savvy as like the top guys, and they were literally looking at meters on the console of a click track and a kick drum. And when they deviated, they go, "Oh, you missed one. Go out and play this song again for 7 minutes." I mean, this is not fun, you know? And then things started happening with drumming that were just not comfortable for me. In the studio, as multi-track got more popular, they wanted to separate the sound of the drums specifically so that if you hit a tom, there was no buzzing from the snare. And they would do that two ways. One of them is they would tape up drums so that there was no overtones. And the other is they would use noise gates in the studio, so that in order to open the gate, you had to hit the drum at a certain velocity. So if you hit it soft, it wouldn't open it up. So you could do a and it would come in ba ba, 2 hits instead of 6. And I go, what happened? They go, oh, you have to hit it the same velocity every time or you won't open the gate. And so suddenly I'm starting to play more mechanically. It wasn't natural to me. And what I realized in the late 70s, that I hadn't sort of modified the dream I had when I was 14, which was to play drums in a band. And I was still using that as my premise for doing everything. What I started realizing is that I really liked making records, but the playing drums part was starting to become something, the thing I loved started becoming the thing I didn't love so much. And like I said to you before, one of the premises that I've worked on was that I wanted to play music I liked. I found that I did my best work when I was fully engaged. I'm like not the most talented guy that's out there, but I could be really focused and be as good as anybody when I'm fully engaged. When I'm not, then you just become another guy. So the whole trick to me was finding things that could keep me present and accounted for, and not just phoning it in. I had a lot of friends who wound up playing on club dates, at bar mitzvahs and weddings to make their money, just so they could say they were playing their instrument. And it's like, I don't love that instrument so much that I'm going to let it take me down paths that make me unhappy. I wasn't in it for that. And I realized that drums were a means to an end for me, during that time. It's still what I was doing. So anyway, a friend of mine who I was in a band with in the early 70s was working at Billboard magazine. And he and another guy who worked there, when the first rap record came out, Rapper's Delight, Sugar Hill Gang, people calling it like a novelty. They thought that there was more life in that world. And one of those two guys knew some people in the Bronx who were in that hip hop community. And the guy that he knew was Russell Simmons. And Russell was just like a local promoter guy who had this kid, Kurtis Blow. And so we made this record. They called me up, my friend who was one of the producers. He didn't really know who to call. He called me up and I helped him find some musicians. A bunch of white guys from Long Island wound up coming in and playing. There was this one guy, Larry Smith, who was like, one of the real founding fathers of hip hop. He was in on that scene. There were a lot of cool people who wound up being involved in that. But we got into it, and it was still an offshoot of old James Brown and Chic kind of live playing. There were no machines involved at that time. And so we made this Christmas record called Christmas Rappin', and it was like a hit in England. So he was signed to Mercury. He was like the rapper who was signed to a major label. And so they let us make another record. And that next record was the song called The Breaks. These Are the Breaks. It was like a huge record. It was actually the first gold 12-inch record. All of those records that sold tons were all on indie labels. They were not affiliated with the RIAA, so there were no legitimately gold and platinum albums for those companies. But because this was on Mercury, this was like the first gold 12-inch, and it was the first hit I played on, and it was in a genre I knew nothing about. And the irony.
How'd you feel when you first heard it on the radio, though?
There's nothing better than hearing that, that was coming full circle. That was like the achievement. Finally something, but it was in an idiom where, the soul music part of it, I was familiar with, obviously, but it was the beginning of the whole world of rap. And, you know, it was more like, you know, toasting and boasting kind of rappers. It hadn't gotten dark, you know, and gone gangsta yet. But so we made the first album. The second album, all of a sudden, like somebody comes in with a Roland 808 and says, I got this beat. You know, you got to play this thing. It was like, I just tapped out stuff with all these busy, boom, boom, ba. And all of a sudden, I'm like supposed to be playing that stuff. I'm going, oh, this is not good. You know, I don't have those kind of chops. And they were not written by a drummer. It was not a very dramistic thing. They were beats. It was the beginning of this whole rhythm stacked on top of each other to create like the package that, you know, and, you know, I seen the writing on the wall. I finally got something that was being successful. And here came this little device, and I saw like my life flash in front of me. It's like, oh, this is fucked up, you know, and I was working with another guy at the time who had a little home studio, and he didn't have a drum kit. This guy could play everything. But so he played his kick drum on an ARP synthesizer with 2 fingers, and he played a snare drum with 2 hands. And then he played a hi-hat. He didn't have a hi-hat. He stuck a cymbal on his couch, and he would play that. And they were all these great parts, but they were disconnected in the sense that they were not played at one time by a human being. They were sense of rhythms that were stacked together. And I had to learn how to play this stuff. And so all of a sudden, drumming to me became like work. You know, it was uncomfortable because I didn't feel like I was in my wheelhouse. I had been playing for like 15 years. And it was moving to a place that was not really where I felt comfortable. It's not like I didn't understand it. It's just that when you physically have to present it, your limitations will surface, you know? I mean, I'm familiar with all kinds of music. And so when we were at that studio, Green Street Studios, on this Kurtis Blow record, there was like a mixed magazine in the lounge. And I go and pick it up and I start looking through it. And there's this picture of a box with buttons on it. And at the top of the ad, it says, real drums. I'm going, what's this? And it was the first Lynn drum, the LM1. And so I saw the picture of this thing, and I'm sitting in the place where all this stuff's going on. I'm going, if I only had this box right now, you know, I mean, it was like to protect myself as much as anything. That change happened, but it was an evolution through the 70s to get there. You know, you know, the thing that happened in the 70s for me is that all my friends, rather than being full-time committed to any one thing, started playing in a lot of different groups, working with a lot of singers, songwriters. There was no commitment. It was like, I'll be in 10 bands, and whichever one connects, I'll stay with. You know, so that sense of camaraderie started going away. That team thing that I liked about being in a band started going away. And I was never cut out to be a studio drummer. It was like I was not that dedicated to the instrument like some guys are. And one of those projects, the guy who played all the parts on his synthesizers was signed to Portrait Epic Records. And we wound up mixing at the Power Station. That's how I wound up at Power Station, was on this guy's record. And I'm looking around, I'm seeing all the great musicians who were working there. I'm going, you know, I'm being realistic with myself. I'm not as good as those guys, you know, as a drummer. And, you know, I didn't really care. I realized that I just wanted to be working at the studio more than I cared about playing the drums, you know, and that was like a big epiphany for me. That was my first moment of reinvention in this long career of reinventions, you know. And what I realized was, you know, all these great artists were playing there, and I saw like those drum machines stacked up in a corner with like Dire Straits or Hall & Oates. They all owned this stuff, and none of them knew how to use it really. So, you know, I just kind of smelled the opportunity. The thing cost like, you know, $3,000. I had like $3,100 to my name. And I went for it. I just bought the damn thing. And the first thing that happened is I get a call from Mike Maneri, who was working with Carly Simon. They had this song, and people were very curious about all the technology, you know? So all of a sudden, I was like in the right place, the right time. And I always say to people, the difference between me and a lot of other people I knew who had these boxes is I read the manual. I actually knew how to work the thing. So, and I also was a drummer. Most drummers like were really resistant to this technology. And for me, it was just like, well, everything I was doing was screaming for it. You know, you want the drum perfect with the click track? There it is. You know, you want to play around and get a kick drum sound for 4 hours? Here, I'll just put it on a loop and I'll go in the lounge. You know, everything about it for me was right for the moment, you know, and, you know, I was really unhappy with the state of my drumming business at that time, you know, just not so much the work, but the fact that it was the kind of work that was not making me happy. Not happy, me no good. You know what I mean? So, you know, the 70s was a strange time for me. You know, there was a lot of different musical styles going on. And, you know, I realized just being the drummer was not going to be the way I stayed in this thing. So, you know, I had a good time. I had a great band in like 1979 with Mark Rivera from Billy Joel's band. And Jimmy Ryan, who was Carly Simon's guitarist on You're So Vain, and he was in a band called the Critters. It was like a great band, and the front guy was a guy named Jimmy Frank, who sounded like, he's a white guy, sounded like Ray Charles, and he was great. And we got together to do a pickup gig with him, and we learned 20 songs in like 2 hours. It was like the most kinetic thing. And when that band fell apart for business reasons, I realized, you know what? There's no way that I'm going to be the drummer in somebody else's band and make that happen. It was the reality of, you know, being 30 years old, you know, and still trying to do the same thing I was trying to do when I was 14. You know, some people it worked for, other people it didn't. You know, for me, you know, I came to the realization that, you know, if I wanted to stay doing this, I'd have to figure out some other way to pull it off, you know?
Yeah.
So
you found you seized a great opportunity and found a niche of need.
You know, that was like a seminal moment for me because, you know, change is something that a lot of people are always afraid of, you know, and I made a huge change and it paid off at like a moment where I was either going to fall off the side of a cliff or something good was going to happen, you know. And
you took that leaving $100 in your bank account leap of faith.
I did. And, you know, it taught, you know, there's a lot of things that came out of it, trusting your instincts, you know, really learning to, you know that what you feel is really important. You know, the only opinion you really have is what you feel, you know, anything else, you're making stuff up. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like you could talk yourself into anything except how you feel. You know, so it's a great barometer when you're producing, where you have to make decisions like on the fly.
Your gut, yeah.
You know, and so even though we're a very data-driven world today, you know, the truth is this is a gut business. I mean, it's so honestly, so is baseball. You know, everybody who's like into the numbers and stuff. For me, the numbers always tell you what just happened. They don't tell you what's going to happen. You know what I mean? And when something happens that's not with the numbers, they go, oh, it's an anomaly and stuff. That's no anomaly. It's, you know, that's just the way things are. You know, when you trust, you know, the data won't really predict the future, you know, accurately. And all change comes from somebody who does something different anyway, you know, so you kind of can't be afraid to be in that lonely space. You know, so those are all the things I learned at that moment, which had nothing to do with drumming, which had everything to do with anything I wound up doing moving forward. So
let me jump in if I could, Jimmy. Maybe take a breath. That was a great summation of the 70s and how you got, you know, into that spot with the studio work. Thank you for that. Just a couple quick questions related to the Kurtis Blow thing.
Yeah.
Did you meet him? Did you spend much time with him?
Yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, it was like when worlds collide. We had John Tropez was playing guitar on the breaks. You know, so there was like sort of a real seasoned jazz guy, you know, playing those chords, you know, playing those rhythms, and he was great. And Kurtis, you know, it was like worlds, separate worlds in some ways. He was hanging out in the lounge while we were cutting tracks a lot of the time, and you know, we became as friendly as you know you can in those environments where there's a lot of activity going on. But you know, Russell was brand new at that game. You know, it was the first record he ever made was that stuff. And so a lot of people came out of that. I didn't really spend enough time with those guys. You know, once again, the pressure, we didn't really know totally what we were doing in terms of a roadmap, you know, as far as how to make these kind of records. So there was a lot of heat when I was there. Like for me, I try to focus really heavily on what I'm doing. So I do have blinders on sometimes where, you know, it's not that casual. Like I've been in the studio with so many like amazing people, and I always have to temper it with the fact that I'm there to do a job. And, you know, I'm always humbled by that part of it. You know, it's not like meeting somebody in a restaurant or something. So Kurtis was a guy kind of kept to himself, or kept, you know, there was a clique of, you know, his people who came from the Bronx, and you know, and the Hollis Queens guys, you know, Run DMC. Those guys would come. They were kids. They were hanging out in the lounge at the sessions and stuff like that, and everybody was sponging off of what was going on. But for me, it was a lot of work because you know I was at a point where the record making was like being very accurate drumming wise. It was not so much playing it with your feel and running the show. It was like the click is going like this, and you know I'm playing stuff like this, and how do I hear the click when my kick drum is doing the exact same thing the click is doing? It was a lot of work for me.
Well, the breaks in
So
particular had a lot of percussion in it, though.
there were two of us. There was this guy Jimmy Delgado, who was a timbali player. And so we tagged off. We would trade solos and stuff like that, you know. So, you know, I guess the song, you know, these are the breaks, you know, breaks on a bus, breaks on a train, you know, those kind of breaks. And then drum breaks was the other breaks on that. And so I did the first solo on it, and he did the, you know, all of that timbali stuff. And he was like amazing. And then we did stuff together, and that was kind of fun. Those were like, I did the drum track, and then we overdubbed the solos on top of that stuff. And you know, a lot of it's a little bit of a blur to me, to be honest with you, because it was so intense. Just you know, I can't really explain the collision of worlds that was going on those sessions. And it was the first time I really was in the studio playing with, you know, some crack studio guys, you know, who just came from doing 3 other sessions and were warmed up completely. And me and my friends, we didn't do sessions hardly at all. So it'd take like 45 minutes just to kind of shake out the cobwebs and get, those guys were like ready to leave by the time we were ready to start, you know. So there was all kinds of stuff going on. The yin and the yang of it was pretty amazing.
Well, I have a soft spot for those tunes, Jimmy, because I was DJing then, so I definitely, you know, was playing the Xmas rap and and the breaks and all those. And you were also involved with basketball, that track.
I'm a co-author of such material. Yeah, I'm a co-writer on that. You know, it was quite something. There was a cast of characters that kept expanding. That was like the 4th album, and you know, this group Full Force, who became really well known themselves, were like they were kind of discovered by my friend JB and Robert Ford, the producers of Kurtis. You know, kind of took those guys under their wing until they became, you know, like really well known on their own. So they were involved, and I had my Lynn drum at the time, and we decided we were going to sample a basketball dribble. And in those days, you had to have a chip made of the sound. It was not digital sampling in any which way, like in a computer. So we made the sound of a basketball dribble. We sent it out to the Lynn drum company, and they sent it back. And I used the sound of that basketball for the kick drum and for the tom toms. And it was kind of fun. Those were hardcore. The Kurtis and his crew, this guy Billy Bill, who wrote a lot of the lyrics to that, were hardcore Knicks fans, like hardcore. And once again, I'm kind of like on a drive-by. I'm in the middle of all this stuff, and part of my role was, as a conduit to help these guys see this sort of vague vision. It was like a cloudy vision, but they knew. People know what they want. They can't always articulate it, as something I've found over the years, but most people who write, they do know what they want. They'll always tell me, well, I'm not a drummer. It's like, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's like, I know you know what it wants to feel like. So there was a lot of that going on with that record, is that there were people who knew, they imagined, they were creating a genre, essentially. And Kurtis's thing, because of the people involved, there was singing involved, and it was a little more on the pop side of what was starting to go on then, where it was kind of getting tougher, sound wise, attitude wise. But Kurtis was a personality, and he was a great MC. But then you started getting like the Run DMC guys. They were like, even the next generation, like 3 years in, there was a whole other generation of guys coming up. So it was just always interesting, the cast of characters on those. We wound up making a record with Rodney Dangerfield too, Rappin' Rodney.
Oh yeah.
And actually I made rap records with Billy Crystal, with Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo. It was kind of like this cottage industry that I wound up, being involved in. And once again, I was into other stuff completely. My heart was elsewhere, but this is where the opportunities were. And there's a whole irony in that of, what you love and what you get to do. They don't always collide. I finally got it to collide in the way I wanted it to over time. But, it was just interesting working with those guys, because they were so into, it was their culture. I feel like I was just sort of, sneaking in, I just like, had a backstage pass or something. It wasn't my world.
Yeah.
But
like riding their bus. Yeah.
But they were relying on me to channel these ideas that they had to make them come out of the speakers, and, I got really good at interpreting, and I could make the machine do way more than I could with a pair of sticks. So I wound up doing jazz records. I wound up working with like crazy, super talented people who were, I made a record with Michael Brecker that's just, I'm really proud of it. It's called Escher Sketch. And it was like a layer of drum beats. One was a swing beat and one was a funk beat that we merged together to create this thing. At any given time, it might sound like it's swinging or it's playing funky. It's like, it was pretty deep. And there was no way anybody could play it. It's like two drummers parts, and I'm sitting here with like freaking genius musician going, man, I was fortunate I was working with that technology, because I could make it do whatever I wanted to at that point with the tools I had. I could pretty well do anything, which I certainly couldn't have done drumming. I worked with Jeff Beck with Nile, and I'm sitting in a control room with Jeff Beck. It was like the weirdest thing. I'm tapping out a rockabilly beat on a Lynn drum and he's playing it. We're jamming together. It was surreal. I mean, but those were the scenarios I would get myself into, in those days. So the basketball thing was just another one of those where I'm around all this stuff. They got the guy from the Knicks to do the announcement at the beginning of the song. It was like crazy. It was a lot of fun, but it was work for me because it wasn't my natural instinct to be doing some of that stuff. I should just make a mention relative to me and rap and drum machines. And Keith LeBlanc, you know, is such a motherfucker. He is such a monster at that. You know, I never ever could think of being able to do that. I would love to, but you know, there were guys doing that made me know that, you know, I needed my own version of it in order to compete. You know, I was very fortunate that I got in on the ground floor of what I did, when I did, where I did, you know, because that was a real volatile time for drums and drumming. And you know, that technology is now a part of the palette of almost anybody. No person coming up, you know, has a negative reaction to that technology. But I had a situation at Power Station where a drummer for a pretty well-known artist came into the control room late at night and saw that drum machine sitting in the control room. He tried to pick it up. Luckily, it was all plugged into the console. He tried to throw it through the control room window. You know, so that's the kind of stuff I was dealing with. It was a really, you know, funny moment in time, you know, for me, while you're having like sort of you're receiving all this music. I'm in the middle of like it going down in the studio. And so there was like this real volatile little culture wars thing going on at the time. Most of the artists really were curious about the technology. And of course, it was the sound du jour. So everybody wanted to like stay contemporary, you know? So,
Well,
but it was wild. It was a wild time.
I can no doubt between that and the synthesizers, you know, putting corn players out of work, it was quite a time.
Well, that's when I hooked up with Bova. You know, we had played, I played live with Bova at an airport in like Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was like this little tiny airport that had a bar, you know, at the airport. It was like a little local airport. And the band played, you know, normally they would have booze against the back wall of the bar. They had the band. We were like behind the bar, a very narrow little area where we were set up. And Jeff was playing organ, I was playing drums. That's when I met him. And so ironically, we both got involved in the electronic stuff at a similar time in like 82, 83. And, you know, he probably told you about, you know, how we got together and stuff, but it was, I was working with Cyndi Lauper, and, you know, in those days they would bring me in, they would give me a cassette of a demo, you know, here's the song, do the drums. I'm going, well, what about everything else? Just do the drums first, then we'll bring in a bass player. And it's like, my whole thing was always interactive. It's just like, I play a drum part along with other people. So I had to guess what other people were going to do. And with Cyndi, I knew this was going to be a problem. So I'd said to her, you know, I got this friend of mine, he plays keyboards. And, you know, if I bring him in, we can do this together. You'll be able to hear everything all at once, you know. So she was okay with that. But the technology was so, now you saw Jeff's rig, right? Because I think he had his rig was behind him. He had tons of stuff. Well, what happened in those days was he would have 2 or 3 synths, and, you know, so we'd get a bass and drums. He'd get a bass sound using all 3 synths stacked together to get a sound. And she'd go, okay, great. Now let's do a piano part. Well, all my synths are being used for the bass. So he wound up having to keep buying equipment to do these gigs. And it turned into this where we could literally push a button and play the whole record all at once. And that was something you couldn't do. This all evolved from that, from what we were just talking about. I know he was coming from like doing Change and some Herbie Hancock with Laswell and stuff. And I was working with Hall & Oates and Nile, and started working with Russ Titleman and Jim Steinman, you know, and I started bringing Jeff in on all the gigs I had because I couldn't just do drums, you know. So we had our little band, you know, and so those are the things that started happening as a result of all of those other records and situations. Like we created a whole other scene that, you know, we were right in the middle of, because we were at the best studio.
Let me ask you this from a philosophical, if you will, perspective, Jimmy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, back then, were you considering how to make music that would be, you know, of that era, of that time, but then also somehow remain timeless? I mean, how do you balance that so that it doesn't sound so dated and it endures?
Well, you don't. That's for time to determine, because the truth is everybody wants it to sound like whatever is happening now. That's generally the way, people were. The people I was working with, though, I would be working with like a Peter Gabriel or a Laurie Anderson or a Hall and Oates, who always, it was funny going from a situation where I was working with people who had no success to winding up making like follow-up records to big hits and stuff, or working with Madonna on her sophomore album, after having a hit, what do you do next? It was like an amazing amount of intense stuff that went on with making those records. And it was always of the moment. I really think that the timelessness, like I worked on that Steve Winwood Back in the High Life album, right? Which is, a lot of people think of it as a timeless record at this point. We knew it was a great record, but timeless is, you got to go through some time before half of the records in those days sound dated because they were all into the big drum sound, the big snare drum. That was like the big 80s thing, put the drummer in the room instead of, in the 70s the drummers usually were in a little booth like in the corner of the studio that was like all blocked off with carpeting and stuff like that. In the 80s they put the drummer out in the room with the wood floors and stuff like that to get the biggest sound, that whole Springsteen style. That was a real change. The 70s, it's yacht rock now, but it was all very close sounding studio, Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, Doobie Brothers. The rock stuff was contained. Then it went like that. The drums took over the room in the studio in the 80s. So sonically, people got tricked into my snare drum is bigger than your mentality, and those records do not hold up sonically. At the time they were just what everybody wanted, but I don't know anybody who goes in to make a timeless record. I've never experienced that. I think that those records come from people who are not trying to follow a trend necessarily, when you have the Me Too guys, because that's another thing I deal with is leaders and followers. The leaders tend to make records that will have what you're talking about, because they're not trying to mimic the moment. The minute you're trying to follow up something, you're containing the space that you're operating in some ways. And then it's a matter if you make that great record, if it's just great, if it's a seminal thing, but you don't really know. You just try and make it as good as you can while you're doing it. That's stuff for other people to decide. It's what works for the song. My whole thing was always, what do you want it to sound like? What's the vibe? What's the feel? What are you going for? And then try and doll something up to make it fit. I call it the yeah factor. When you get it right, everyone goes, yeah. Even if they don't know what they're looking for, they know when they hear it, And so when you're working with producers and writers and artists, part of it is trying to get inside of what they're trying to do, is the way I work, as opposed to here's how I think your record should go, right? There's two ways to operate as the studio guy. Oh, here's your song. This is how I think it should go. Or let me help you try and accomplish the goal that you imagine, that's a different path. And it's always worked for me because I get fed information rather than constantly just push out my own ideas. I react to other people, like we're having a conversation. You say something, it's going to make me say something else, and vice versa. If one of us is just talking, then it just goes out. So it's an interesting dynamic.
How do you decide, when or where to use actual versus electronic drums?
Well, see, there's the one thing with the real drummer and a good drummer. It's got to be the right guy, because the drum machine will beat the wrong live guy. You know what I mean? It's like there's music that's written at this point, you talk about hip hop. So much hip hop is electronics driven or loop driven. If it's live drums, it's a loop. It's of a moment of a live drummer. But hip hop is a quantized medium. It's all done in the computer now, and so the electronic thing, it's almost like a moot point in so much music today. It doesn't really matter because, once again, it's a semantics thing. When I started doing this, recording, and George Martin sort of indicated this, he says up until a certain point, recording was like taking a photograph. It's like everybody played and you captured the moment, right? The minute you started getting into this overdubbing world, it started being like painting a picture, right? And everything today is painting. There's very little live recording going on, and all the great old records that still stand up were performances of people who knew how to play, together all at once, and there was this combustible energy that created, dare I use the word, magic. When things happen at the same time, you could do takes, but one take, everybody like connects, and it's better than the others, even though it's the same parts. That does not happen today. The best you could do is have a guy do a take of his part to something that's already there, but that other guy doesn't get to react to the new guy. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the chemistry.
I did this record with Mark Rivera, who's in Billy Joel's band, and he's also Ringo's music director. I said, Mark, can we get Ringo to play on a song? And I finally got him to make the call, and Ringo said yes. So we had this track, and it was a track that we had created, kind of one thing at a time. And then Ringo comes and plays drums on it. I got Ringo Starr playing on a song that I co-wrote. It was like, are you kidding me? And then I realized, you know what? Nobody on this record is playing with Ringo. He's just sitting on top of all these other parts. I'm going, this is horrifying. So I called up Will Lee. I said, listen, man, I got to get, somebody's got to play with this guy. It's like, what a waste. What a waste, and imagine they were all in the room together. The energy that comes from that interaction is something that's been pulled out of the recording process. Now, I mean, and that's why, I have a saying that if you're not going for feel, you're going for perfect. And most records today, it's just getting the parts right. They make them in time and in tune. That sounds a little out with this, it's like controlling stuff that we never controlled, so the record making of today is a little bit different than the way it used to be, which I think, makes the electronics side of it a valid way to go, because, people change their mind all the time today. That's why we record, quote, in the box, and everybody knows, oh, could you make this vocal a little louder here? In the old days, you had to set up the studio just to make the one move. Now it's all saved. So people like to change their ideas all the time. And it's a lot easier to change an electronic drum part than a live performance.
Also the danger of doing it too much and you lose whatever was there.
It's all dangerous today that way, because having control over something that wants to be a little bit chaotic in that way, there's something magical about music performance. It used to be people up until 25, 30 years ago, if you played music, you had to get other people together to play. Now you could just do it yourself. It's a whole other world, a whole other palette. I just feel bad that it's sort of been to the exclusion of the other thing, because that other thing is mystical. But a lot of guys don't learn how to play today. They learn their first band is them in their laptop, right? And they learn that if they make a mistake, they have the equipment to fix it. So very few people will go and do a whole take. They'll get a part and they'll copy it and paste it, right? It's like a science project. So what most of the music lacks is that kinetic spirit, that heartbeat of a moment in time that you can feel, and And that's the only downside to me of all this.
There's much more to this great Truth and Rhythm interview. Just continue on to the next part of the episode. Also, be sure to subscribe to this channel. If you've already done so, please share it with friends. And become a member by joining Truth and Rhythm on Patreon or consider donating at funkinstuff.net. Thank you very much.